Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads. We're going to start with the bad seed. 1. Later that summer, when Mrs. Penmark looked back and remembered when she caught up in despair so deep she knew there was no way out, no solution whatever for the circumstances that encompassed her, it seemed to her that the June 7th, the day of the Fern Grammar School picnic, was her day of her last happiness, for never since she had known contentment or felt peace. The picnic was an annual traditional affair held on the beach and among the oaks of Benedict. The old Fern summer place at Pelican Bay. It was here that the impeccable Fern sisters had been born and lived through their languid, eventless summers. They had refused to sell the old place and had kept it up faithfully as a gesture of love, even when necessity made them turn their townhouse into a school for the children of their friends. The picnic was always held on the first Saturday of June, since the eldest of three sisters, Miss Octavia, was convinced, despite the occasions on which it had rained that particular day, and the picnic had to be held inside after all, that the first Saturday of June was an invariable fine one. When I was a little girl, as many of you are today, she would say each season to her pupils, we always planned a picnic at Benedict for the first Saturday of June. All our relatives and friends came, some who we hadn't seen for months. It was a sort of a reunion, really, with laughter and surprises and gentle, excited voices everywhere. Everyone had a happy, beautiful day. There was no dissension in those days. A quarrel was unknown to the society of the well-bred, a crossword never exchanged between ladies and gentlemen. My sister and I remember those days with love and great longing. At this point, Miss Burgess Fern, the middle sister, the practical one who handled the business affairs of the school, said it was so much easier in those days with a house full of servants and everybody helpful and anxious to please. Mother and some of the servants would drive down to Benedict a few days in advance of the picnic, sometimes as early as the 1st of June, when the season was officially open, although the establishment residents of the coast didn't consider the season full really in swing until the day of our picnic. Benedict is such a beautiful spot, said Miss Claudia Fern. Little Lost River bounds our property on the Gulf side, and the flows into the bay there. Miss Claudia taught art at the school, and automatically she added, the landscape at the point reminds one so much of those charming river scenes by Bon Boys. Then, feeling some of her pupils might not know who Bon Boys was, she went on, for the sake of some of the younger groups, Bon Boys is a modern French primitive. Oh, he is so cunning in his artlessness, so right in his composition, and so on in the handling of green. You'll learn much about Bon Boys later on. It was from the Ferntown house, the school itself, that the picnickers were to begin their day of pleasure, and the parents of each pupil have been asked to have their particular child on the school lawn no later than 8 o'clock, when the charter buses were scheduled to leave. Thus, it was that Mrs. Christine Penmark, who disliked being late or keeping others waiting, set her clocks for 6, which she felt would allow her time for her ordinary tasks of the morning, and for the remembrance of those last-minute hurried things which were so easily overlooked. She had impressed the hour on her mind, saying to herself as she fell asleep, you will wake precisely at 6 o'clock, even if something happens to your alarm. The alarm went off promptly, and yawning a little, she sat up in bed. It was, she saw instantly, to be a beautiful day. The day Miss Octavia had promised. She pushed back her blonde, almost flaxen hair, and went on to the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror for a long moment, her toothbrush held languidly in her hand, as though she were not quite decided what to do. Her eyes were grave, wide-set, and serene, her skin tanned and firm. She drew back her lips in the first tentative trial smile of the day, and standing thus in front of the mirror, she listened absently to the sounds outside her window. An automobile starting in the distance, the twittering of sparrows in the live oaks that line the quiet street, The sound of a child's voice raised suddenly and hushed. Then, coming awake quickly, in possession once more of her usual energy, she bathed and dressed and went to her kitchen to begin breakfast. Later, she went to her daughter's room to waken her. The room was empty, and it was so tidy that it gave the impression of not having been used a long time. The bed was neatly remade, the dressing table immaculate, with each object in its custom place, turning at its usual angle. On a table near the window was one of the jigsaw puzzles that her daughter delighted in, a puzzle only half completed. Mrs. Penmark smiled to herself and went to the child's bedroom. The bedroom was as orderly as the bathroom was as orderly as the bedroom had been, with the bath towel spread outside precisely to dry. And Christine, seeing things, laughed softly, thinking, I never deserved such a capable child. When I was 8 years old, I doubt if I could do anything. She went to the wide, elaborate hall with its elegant, old-fashioned parquetry floors of contrasting woods and called gaily, Rhoda, Rhoda, where are you, darling? Are you up and dressed so soon? The child answered in her slow, cautious voice, as though the speaking of words were a perilous thing to be debated. Here I am, she said, here in the living room. When speaking of her daughter, the adjectives that others most often used were quaint, or modest, or old-fashioned. And Mrs. Penmark, standing in the doorway, smiled in agreement and wondered from what source the child inherited her repose, her neatness, her cool self-sufficiency. She said, coming into the room, were you really able to comb and plait your hair without my helping you? And the child half turned so their mother could inspect her hair, which was straight, fine spun, and of a dark, dull brown. Her hair was plaited precisely in two narrow braids, which were looped back into thin hangman nooses and were secured, in turn, with two small bows of ribbon. Mrs. Penmark examined the bows, but seeing that they were compact and firm tightly, the brushed her lips over the child's brown bangs and said, breakfast will be ready in a moment. I think you better eat a good breakfast today, as there's nothing more uncertain about a picnic than the arrival of lunch. Rhoda sat down at the table, her face fixed an expression of solemn innocence. Then she smiled at some secret thought of her own, and once there was a shallow dimple in her left cheek, she lowered her chin and raised it thoughtfully. She smiled again, but very soft, an odd, hesitant smile that parted her lips this time and showed the small, natural gap between front teeth. I adore that little gap between dear Rhoda's teeth, Mrs. Monica Breedlove, who lived the floor above. I said only the day before. You know, Rhoda is such an outmoded little girl with her bangs and pigtail and that single dimple. She reminds me of the way children looked when my grandma was young. Now, it was a colored print in my grandma's house I've always remembered. It was a little girl skating. Oh, it was such immaculate, such a self-possessed little girl with flowing hair, striped stockings, lace boots, and a fur toque that matched a little fur muff. She was smiling as she skated, and there was a darling gap between her teeth, too. The more I think of it, the more the child reminds me of Rhoda. She stopped stalking suddenly, wondering if her affection for the little Penmark girl had somehow determined by her reaction so many years ago to her grandma's skating print. For Mrs. Breedlove denied the existence of the meaningless thought. Everything said, she maintained, no matter how casually it was related, was tied together, was part of a logical and quite comprehensible pattern if others could find clues or glimpse the simple design. She came to the conclusion that her admiration of the cover print was the genesis of her admiration for the child. There was no doubt about it. None at all. Then she remembered that her brother Emery, with whom she lived, loved the little girl quite as much as she did. Now, Emery's affection was certainly not the associative end result of a old lithograph, for he was 9 years younger than herself. There was no reason then to assume that he even seen the old skinny print. In fact, her grandmother died, and her effects had been scattered 2 years before Emery was born, so it was very doubtful that, in other words, there was no reason to suppose. She waited, wondering if her system of association wisdom was so effective as she believed. Her brows puckered in perturbation. She had said these things and thought these thoughts the morning before while returning leisurely with Mrs. Penmark and her daughters from the closing exercises of the Fern School. There had been the customary recitations with the customary lapses of memory and the usual flow of tears, the fumbling application of parental handkerchiefs, the traditional caresses and words of comfort. Miss Burgess Fern, the middle one, had made her expected speech on honor and the need for fair play. There was a harp solo by Miss Fern herself, who had once studied in Rome. When these preliminaries were done, with the chorus of children had sung the school song, the prizes for the different excellencies were awarded. At the end, the most important prize of all, in the minds of the pupils, was given: the gold medal awarded to the child who showed the greatest improvement in penmanship during the school year. The hallmark of the lady or gentleman is the quality of his penmanship, Miss Octavia Fern so often said. The clarity, the elegance, and refinement of one's penmanship establishes the true character and background of the individual, and all other tests are conclusive. Rhoda had wanted the penmanship medal from the very beginning, and from the first thought she would win it. She had practiced faithfully, the tip of her tongue protruding between her teeth, the pen clutched in her determined hand. But as it happened, the beautiful medal had not gone to herself, but to a thin, timid little boy named Claude Daugle, who was in her class and in her age. Okay, so one thing I'm curious about is that she didn't win the penmanship medal, but did she not win anything else? I guess not. When exercises were over and the pupils and their parents were strolling under the live oaks of the fern lawn, Miss Claudia came up, resting her hand on Rhoda's shoulder, and said, "You mustn't feel badly about not winning the medal, although I know how important these things are at your age. It was a very close race this year." Then, turning to Mrs. Breedlove, she added, "Rhoda worked so hard. She labored so diligently to improve her penmanship. We all know how badly she wanted to win the medal, and I, for one, was sure she'd win it. But our judges, who are entirely impartial, who don't even know the identity of the children whose work they inspect, decided that the little Daugle boy, while not writing the clear hand that Rhoda used, did show the greatest improvement for the term, and improvement is what the medal is given for, after all." Remember these things on the day before, knowing how disappointed the child was, the reason for her quietness now. Christine said gaily, "You must have had a perfectly wonderful day. When you're as old as I am, and perhaps have a little girl of your own who goes to school picnics, you can look back on today and remember it with pleasure." Rhoda sipped her orange juice, turning her mother's words over in her mind with no emotion in her voice, as though repeating a thing which did not really concern her. She said, "I don't see why Claude Daugle got the medal. It was mine. Everybody knew it was mine." Christine touched the child's cheek with her finger. "These things happen to us all the time," she said, "and when they do, we simply accept them. If I were you, I'd forget the whole thing." She drew the child's head toward her. Rhoda submitted to the caresses with that tall and withdrawn patience of the pet that can never be quite domesticated, and then, smoothing down her bangs, she impatiently pulled away from her mother. But perhaps she had been considerate or unwise. She smiled, her quick, placating smile, her pink pointed tongue darting toward her glass. Christine laughed softly and said, "I know you don't like to have people paw at you. I'm sorry. It was mine, said Rhoda stubbornly. The medal was mine. Her round, light brown eyes were stretched and unyielding. It was mine, she said. The medal was mine. Christine sighed and went to the living room, and kneeling on the old window seat, she hooked back the heavy old-fashioned shutters, allowing the soft morning sunlight to flood the room. It was almost 7 o'clock, and when the street was rapidly waking up, old Mr. Middleton came onto the front porch, yawned, scratched his stomach, and swooped cautiously picked it up morning paper. The cooks for the Truby and Kunkel families, approaching from opposite directions, nodded, raised their hands in greeting, disappeared almost at the same instant. Around the corners of their respective houses, the half-grown girl, with legs as shapeless and almost thin as the lines in a child's drawing of a girl, pulled her scarf more tightly about her head and ran for her bus with a clumsy looping motion, her ankles turning a little like the ankles of an inexperienced skater. Mrs. Penmark, seeing these familiar things, turned back to her living room and began to straighten up. When her husband's work had gone back to the particular line, they had looked forward to a house of their own. Having spent their entire married life in apartments, but not having once found what they wanted, they had taken another apartment after all, deciding vaguely to build later on. The apartment house itself consisted of 3 floors of ponderous Victorian elegance. It was of red brick, and its turrets, oriel window spires, and ornamental spouts balanced and matched one another in a sort of impressive architectural madness. It was set on a little natural hillock, well back from the street, and it was banked with shrubs and flanked by a well-intended lawn. When the house was planned, the lot at the back had been bought as a playground for the children who might live someday in the apartment itself, and had been turned into a sort of private park enclosed by a brick wall. It was the playground rather than the big, inefficient apartment which had been attracted the Penmarks in the first place. The bell rang at that moment, and Christine went to answer it. It was Monica Breedlove from the floor above, and she called out gaily, "I wanted to make sure you hadn't overslept on such an important morning. I thought my brother Amory was coming too, but he's still fast asleep. No power in the world can get him up before 8 o'clock. But he did open his eyes long enough to tell me that the car's parked in front of the building and to suggest we use it this morning. So I'm going to drive you and Rhoda to the Fern School if you have any objections. Anyway, it'll save you the trouble getting your car out of the garage." And then turning to the child and tossing her head a little, she added, "I have 2 gifts for you, my darling. The first is from Emery. It's a pair of dark glasses with little rhinestone decorations. He said to tell you it's to keep the sun out of those pretty brown eyes." The child moved quickly toward Mrs. Breedlove with the expression on her face which Christine had come to think of it as Rhoda's acquisitive look. She stood obediently while Mrs. Breedlove adjusted the glasses in them. Then turning, she examined herself in the mirror. Monica stood back, clapped her hands together, and cried out in an enraptured voice, "Now, who is this glamorous Hollywood actress? Can it really be little Rhoda Penmark, who lives with her delightful parents on the first floor of my apartment house? Is it possible that this lovely, sophisticated creature is the little Rhoda Penmark that everyone loves and admires so greatly?" She paused for effect and then continued in a lower key. She went on, "And now for a second prize, which is from me." She took her purse a gold heart with a finely wrought chain attached to it. She explained that the locket had been given to her too when she was 8, and had waited all these years in her jewelry case just for the occasion. The locket had been a birthday present originally, and in one side of the heart there was a garnet, which was her birthstone since she had been born in January. At the first opportunity, she meant to take the locket to the jeweler and have the garnet taken out and the turquoise. which was Rhoda's own birthstone, put instead. She planned to have the locket cleaned and the little chain fixed. The clasp didn't seem to be firm as it should be, which was hardly surprising when you consider that she, Mrs. Breedlove, had had the locket for more than 50 years. "Can I have both stones?" asked Rhoda. "Can I have the little garnet too?" Christine smiled, shook her head disapprovingly, and said, Rhoda, how can you say such a thing?" But Mrs. Breedlove went into the peals of pleased, hysterical laughter. "But of course you may. Why, certainly, my dearest." She seated herself and went on. "How wonderful it is to meet such a natural little girl. Why, when I was given the same locket by my Uncle Thomas Lightfoot, I just stood tongue-tied in the parlor and twisted my plaid dress, a quivering little mass of anxiety and frustration." The child went to her, put her arms around her neck, and kissed her with an intensity that seemed to engage all the consciousness. She laughed softly and rubbed her cheek against the cheek of the entrance woman. "Aunt Monica," she said in a sweet, shy voice, drawing the name out slowly as though her mind could not bear to relinquish with it. "Oh, Aunt Monica." Christine turned and went to the living room. She felt half amused, half concerned. What an actress Rhoda is. She knows exactly how to handle people when it's her advantage to do so. When she returned to the living room, Mrs. Breedlove was expecting her child's dress. "You look like you're going to a fashionable afternoon tea, not a picnic to the beach," she said gaily. "I know I'm behind the times, but I thought children wore coveralls and play suits to picnics. But you, my love, look like a princess in that red and white dotted Swiss dress you're wearing. Now tell me, aren't you afraid you'll get it dirty? Aren't you afraid you'll fall down and scuff those new shoes?" "She won't soil the dress and she won't scuff the shoes," said Christine. She waited a minute as though she was debating with herself and then added, "Rhoda never gets anything dirty, although I don't know how she manages it." Then seeing the question in Mrs. Breedlove's eye, she said, "I wanted her to dress like the other children, but she felt strongly about it. Well, she wants to wear one of her best dresses. I didn't see any real objection." "I don't like coveralls," said Rhoda in an earnest, hesitant voice. "They're not—" She waited as though willing to finish her sentence, and Mrs. Breedlove laughed with pleasure and said, "You mean coveralls aren't quite ladylike, don't you, my darling?" She embraced the tolerant child once more and said in a delightful voice, "Oh, my old-fashioned little darling. Oh, my absolutely quaint little darling." Presently, with the preparation for departure was completed, Rhoda went to her bedroom to put her locket away for safekeeping. As she stepped off the rug, her shoes made a sharp staccato sound on the wood floor. "You sound like Fred Astaire tapping up and down the stairs," said Mrs. Breedlove. "What have you got on your shoes? Isn't that something entirely new? Is this something I haven't heard about?" Rhoda returned, one hand on Miss Monica's shoulder for support, and stood obediently while Mrs. Breedlove lifted each of her feet and examined the new shoes. They were heavier than average, designed for the play of childhood, with thicker heels that had both been reinforced with metal cleats in the shape of half-moons. In explanation, Rhoda said, "I run over my heels all the time, so Mother has these iron pieces put on this pair so they'd last longer. Did you think it was a good idea?" "It was Rhoda's suggestion, not mine," said Christine. "I can't take any credit, I'm afraid. You know how vague and impractical I am most of the time. It never occurred to me at all. It was Rhoda's idea entirely." "I think they're nice," said Rhoda solemnly. "They save money." "Oh, my penurious little sweetheart," said Monica in delight. "Oh, my thrifty little housewife." She embraced the child exuberantly and said, "What are we going to do with her, Christine? Tell me, what are we going to do with this remarkable little creature?" Later, when they came out of the apartment house, they paused on the marble steps that led to the foyer. For Leroy Jessup, the janitor, was hosing down the walk that ran from the house to the street beyond. He worked with aggrieved persistence, as though calling on heaven to witness the injustice done to him, which the soul and everything to bring their trivial task. As he worked, his lips moved in unison with his hands to shape his petulant thoughts for the pleasure. For his mind rehearsed eternally the iniquities that have been forced upon him. Iniquities which he endured in silence, since he was one of those underprivileged ones of the world. The unfortunate son of an unfortunate sharecropper, the pathetic victim of an oppressive system, as everyone knew anything all admitted and had been admitted for a long time. He was conscious that the two women and the little girl had stopped on the steps, but he pretended that he did not see them, and he did not lift his hose from the flooded flagstones so that they could pass. Instead, he turned towards the street, and eyes carefully averted, he guided the stream of water so far up the flagstones that the group had to move quickly into the porch once more. He covered his mouth with one hand to hide his amusement at their consternation. Mrs. Breedlove said patiently, "Leroy, will you kindly move the hose? We're going to use my brother's car. We're as late as it is." He pretended he did not hear her. He wanted to prolong the scene to its limits, but Monica, losing patience with him, called out, "Leroy, have you lost your senses this time?" He stared insolently at her, as though undecided what his next move should be. Then, regretfully, he shifted the hose so that the water fell on the lawn. "I got work to do," he mumbled. "I guess you don't know nothing about that now, do you? I haven't got no time to go bus riding and picnicking. I got plenty of work to do." He stood, hand on his hip, thinking about how unjustly others used him. He didn't live in no big apartment house with servants to wait on him hand and foot. He didn't have no nice automobile to ride around in. He didn't have nothing to ride in but an old broke-down wreck that you couldn't even give to the junk man. He didn't have no fine clothes to wear neither. When he was little, he didn't go to no private school. That cost a pile of money, and was always giving picnics and frolics for its worthless pupils. No, sir, he walked to school himself, in all sorts of weather, too, and mostly with no shoes on his feet. But at that, he was a lot smarter than most of the dumbbells that all the advantages in the world. He could make monkeys out of them dumbbells anytime he wanted to. He felt infinitely sorry for himself. No, sir, he didn't have nothing now, and he didn't have nothing when he was a boy about Rhoda's age. The world was in a plot to cheat him out of what was rightfully his, he thought. He watched as the women and the little girl picked their way to dripping flagstones. When they reached the sidewalk, he wheeled abruptly so the hose lifted and water splashed over the feet of the people he so deeply despised. Mrs. Breedlove's hand, which had been on the floor of the car, dropped with dramatic suddenness. She closed her eyes, her face and her neck turning a deep coral pink as she counted calmly to 10, and then in her well-bred voice she diagnosed Leroy's emotional condition in a detailed manner. In the past, she had thought of him as an emotionally immature, obsessed, torn by irrational rages, and in a sense, a bit on the constitutional psychopathic side. But now, after the demonstration she had just witnessed, she wondered if her diagnosis had been too mild. She thought now that he was definitely a schizophrenic with well-defined paranoid overtones. And another thing, she had quite enough of his discourtesy and surliness, a feeling that the other tenants in the building enthusiastically shared. He might not know it, but it was due to her intervention that he had had a job. The other attendants, including her brother Emery, who was hardly a man to take liberties with, had been in favor of demanding his discharge. But she had pleaded for him, not because she had condoned his actions, but because she considered him disturbed and hardly responsible for some of his irrational acts. Christine touched Mrs. Breedlove's sleeve with a mild, placating gesture. "He didn't mean to wet us," she said. "It was an accident. I'm sure it was." "He meant it," said Rhoda. "I know Leroy well." Mrs. Breedlove shook her shoulders in indignation. "It was no accident, dear Christine. I assure you it was no accident." But suddenly her anger was subsiding, extending her hands tolerantly, she added, "It was deliberately done. The spiteful act of a neurotic child." "He meant to do it," said Rhoda. Her voice was cold and thoughtful, and she stared at Leroy with her round, calculating eyes as though she could see into his quivering mind. When speaking directly to the man, she said, "You made up your mind to do it when we were standing on the steps. I was looking at you when you made up your mind to wed us." Then Leroy, not knowing he had gone too far this time, that his contempt and his fantasies of injustice had betrayed him into an action which his intelligence had not been entirely sanctioned, became very humble and apologetic. He dropped to his knees on the wet pavement, and bending down, he took out his handkerchief, and as a token of his humility and surrender, passed over the shoes of Mrs. Breedlove and her guest. Mrs. Penmark pulled back quickly as though embarrassed, and said, oh, please, no. Monica opened the door of her car. Her anger was gone now, and already ashamed of her outburst. She sighed ruefully and said, "Oh, well, very well, but my patience has a limit, and you may as well realize it." Leroy crumpled the kerchief Hank he had used and threw it down the street. He stood erect, feeling a sense of power returning, a knowledge that he could handle his situation or any other that arose. That good-looking Mrs. Penmark, that dizzy blonde, didn't know what it was about. She was too dumb, when he came right down to it, to understand his contempt for her. She was one of those soft, easy, taken-in ones that went around feeling sorry for people. She was one of the ones that was eat up with kindness. You could do that one dirty trick, but instead of hitting back or hating the hell out of you, she'd feel guilty. Instead, she must be the one that done something wrong. She spat on the lawn, insolent and sure of himself once more. Now that Breedlove dame, that big-talking bitch, was something else again. She'd feel in the wrong too, but for another reason. She thought she was so smart. She thought she knew everybody there was to know. She thought there wasn't nobody as tricky as she was. She'd feel guilty, all right, not because she was humble, but because she was stuck on herself. She didn't expect other people to come up to her standards. It wasn't fair to expect ordinary people to be as delicate and fine and smart as she was. She'd feel bad, all right, but when she thought things over, and to ease her conscience, she sent her maid down with a $10 bill to pay him off for the things he had done to her. That one was really something. He picked up the hose again. The triumph would be his in the end this time, just as it had always been in the past. With these dumbbells, just wait and see. That was all. Just wait. And then Rhoda said, "You did it on purpose. I know the way you are. You knew you were going to do it all the time." There was no resentment in the child's face. There was not even disapproval. There was only a stubborn appraisal of this character that startled him. He knew that the little girl understood him entirely, that nothing he would say or do, that none of his acts, which misled others and got him his way with them, would affect her at all. He turned away in confusion before the cold knowledge in her eyes, as though his weapons had failed him where he was concerned. And as the automobile pulled away from the curb and turned the corner, with the morning sunlight flashing for an instant on Mrs. Breedlove's extended, bejeweled hand, he said underneath his breath, not of Mrs. Breedlove, but of the child, "That bitch, that nasty little bitch, there's nothing I wouldn't put past her. No one would put a knife between your ribs and watch the blood spurt." Rhoda said softly, "Sometimes when Leroy is feeling mean, he says he's lost his key to the park gate and won't open it so the children can come in and play. He wants to make people wait and beg him to open it for them. Leroy is a very mean man, I think." Mrs. Breedlove's usual good humor was now completely restored, and she said, "I simply adore Rhoda's little twang." She tucked the child's earlobe and affects him. "Such a wonderful twang. It's a fascinating little twang, my darling. Won't you teach it to me sometime?" Christine laughed softly and touching her child's hand, she said, "With my shocking Midwestern twang and Candace's New England one, the poor child didn't have a chance, really." Leroy would unscrew the hose from its faucet and prepared to put it away in the basement, thinking, "Nobody can never put nothing on Rhoda. I'll say that much for her, and nobody can put over on me neither. I guess Rhoda and me are just alike. But in this he was mistaken. As we shall see in time, for Rhoda was able to put into actions the things he could only turn over in his mind as fantasies. And that is the end of that chapter. See you later.